Well, I don't know what you thought about the two stories from the Gospel of Mark. You may already know, or you may have noticed that that we have two stories, one inside another. Two stories are told, but one, if you like, is sandwiched. The second story is sandwiched in the first. So the first begins, and then we're interrupted, if you like, with the second story, and then we go back again to the first. So the healing of the woman who touched Jesus's garment takes place in the middle of the story about Jairus and his daughter who is dying. And these two stories are always told in this way in the Gospels, whether you read the stories in Matthew, Mark, as we did today, or in Luke. And if we assume that Mark's Gospel was written first, as we usually do, we might conclude that the writer of Mark's Gospel combined the two stories in just this way. But of course, it's equally possible that Mark found the two stories already combined long before they were ever committed to writing. Perhaps it aided memory to tell them in this way, and perhaps Mark had heard them recorded, not recorded so much, recorded so that people could hear, recorded in storytelling and with storytelling techniques, recorded together, remembered together. Perhaps so, for the two stories speak powerfully and, I think, memorably when told together, as we find them in the Gospels. Perhaps you already know the stories well. They begin, of course, with the arrival of Jesus on the western shore of the Galilean lake. He's surrounded again by a large crowd when Jairus, a synagogue leader, forces his way to the front of the crowd and falls at Jesus's feet. He tells the sorry tale of his little daughter who is ill and near to death. He begs Jesus repeatedly to come and lay his hands on her that she may be made well. We, the readers, hear the details, and our hearts go out to Jairus and to the little girl. We're relieved when Jesus sets out with Jairus on an urgent mission to heal the little girl before it's too late. We wonder, as the reader, will Jesus be in time? Well, we're told that the large crowd followed Jesus and pressed in on him. That detail's going to be important. The large crowd is around him. They're on the way to Jairus' house, but a large crowd is pressing in on him. When suddenly Jesus turned about in the crowd. "Who touched my clothes?" says Jesus. "What do you mean, who touched your clothes?" ask the disciples. "Everyone is touching your clothes. We're in the middle of a great throng." There must have been something about this particular touch. Perhaps it was not a casual touch, but rather an intentional one. Someone had touched Jesus, touched Jesus's garment, just his garment, with intention, with faith or trust. And Jesus, we are told, felt power go out of him. Jesus looked around to see who touched him in this way. And a woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. She fell down before him and told him and the crowd, and I suppose telling us, the readers, what had happened. She must have once been quite well off. for she had been able to count on the care of doctors or physicians in a day when most people would not have been able to afford it. But now she had spent all that she had on doctors and was no better for it. Indeed, her condition was worse than before, and for 12 years she had suffered a continual flow of blood. By the way, you might not know that Mark, by this reading, might be interpreted as an early advocate for something like our NHS. Might you read it that way? For he offers a kind of veiled advocacy for a healthcare system where good, regulated medical care might be available for all, free or at least inexpensive at the point of need. This woman had suffered at the hands of doctors, and not only was she no better, but she was worse off and impoverished. You know, she's a lot like Jairus in that she falls down at Jesus's feet. But there are other ways in which she's very unlike Jairus, and we'll get to those later on. Anyway, Jesus responds to the impoverished woman. He says, daughter, and perhaps connects this story with the other one, Jairus' daughter. He says to the woman, daughter. I think that's the only time that Jesus calls anybody daughter in any of the Gospels. Daughter, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, shalom, and be healed. And so we assume she goes. For with that, the second story is over. But the first one, which it interrupted, has taken a predictably bad turn. The interruption had a consequence. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came to him from the leader's house, the synagogue leader's house, and told the synagogue leader, we assume, your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any further? And we readers, well, our hearts sink a little. It's too late. In the time it had taken for Jesus and the impoverished woman to have their encounter, Jairus' little daughter had died. But Jesus overhears what's being said to Jairus, and he says to the leader of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. I don't know if these words mean a great deal to you. They've been translated into hymnody, and they matter a lot for many of us. Do not fear, only believe. This word believe again that we've been coming across quite a bit. Have faith, trust, enter into a relationship of trust. Do not fear, only believe. Now, eschewing the crowd, Jesus selects a small group, a select group, including the little girl's parents, and they make their way to the synagogue leader's house. A new crowd of mourners surrounds the house, weeping and wailing loudly. And Jesus speaks to them. Why do you make a commotion and weep? Asks Jesus. The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. Don't know if you notice just how many times, you know, people, some oppose Jesus, but here they laugh at him, and it's not the only place. Still, Jesus entered the house, took the little girl by the hand, and said in Aramaic, little girl, get up, or something like it. And immediately the little girl, who we're now told was 12 years old, got up and began walking about. And then that lovely little detail, Jesus says, give us something to eat. See, many of us think Jesus is only interested in theological matters, in religious things. But he's the first to say, give the girl something to eat. Perhaps it was to say, she's not a ghost. She really is alive. But perhaps it was also to recognize the everyday needs of human beings. The family and the disciples, not to mention the 12-year-old girl, were amazed. Of course they were amazed. One who was dead now lives. And ordering them to tell nobody what has happened, Jesus gave that little instruction. Give the girl something to eat. And so the interrupted story concludes, and concludes happily, because Jesus had brought back the 12-year-old girl from the dead. They're marvelous stories, and I hope that you hear them, and if you don't already know them, that you think about them. Far more in these stories than we can possibly discover in just the few moments allowed to us. They tell of remembered incidents in the life of Jesus, but they also tell readers, disciples and potential disciples, a great deal about Jesus, but also about the human condition and the way to life. There's more than we can discover in these few moments, but let me mention just one or two details that I hope you might think about with me. First, did you notice the difference in status between Jairus and the impoverished woman? And did you notice the difference that it makes to the scene, or the two scenes? Jairus is a community leader, a synagogue ruler, or a synagogue leader. He, with others, is probably the money and the brains behind the establishment of the synagogue in a town like Capernaum or some such town. There's nothing unnatural or unexpected about his confronting Jesus with an urgent request. To be sure, he falls at Jesus' feet, as if to say, this is a man of great power whom I must respect. Perhaps even to say that Jesus has divine or godlike capacities. But he falls at Jesus' feet and begs him, taking the humble stance of a supplicant. But at the same time, he has no difficulty reaching the front of the crowd. Nobody is amazed at his entrance. He's a community leader, a male who belongs at the front with Jesus or any other celebrated visitor to the community. Jairus is perhaps well loved, but certainly well respected in the community, and he belongs in the company of Jesus and among all those whom stories are being told about. The impoverished woman, on the other hand, you notice the way she enters the story. So unlike Jairus's, she came up behind Jesus in the crowd and touched his cloak. She seems intent on a secret mission. She does not presume to take center stage. She does not come before Jesus openly or make a show of her request. Quite the opposite. She's ill, desperate for healing, but seemingly unprepared to make an open request to Jesus. We're told only that she's been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years and that she has spent all her money on physicians only to get worse. Most commentators assume that she's suffering from a gynecological condition, but the text does not say so, not specifically. Many assume that by the social and religious concerns of the time, she would be considered to be unclean and that she's a potential source of impurity to others, including Jesus. Indeed, our young church curriculum that I consulted about this story says categorically that she is an outcast. But Mark says nothing at all about this. I think that such assertions misread the nature of impurity in biblical literature. There is nothing unusual about her being there in the crowd, or really about her touching Jesus. She's not an outcast, as if Jewish society at the time of Jesus was rather keen on making outcasts of people. Nobody's surprised that she's there, and nobody tells her to go away. She's not really an outcast, surely. Nobody is amazed by her presence, or even by her audacity. She's an ordinary woman. She's a woman. Perhaps there might have been those in both Greek and Jewish society who thought that the company of Jesus is not a place for women. Perhaps. She has no particular status or power. She's not described as a leader of anything. An ordinary woman. Certainly at the other end of the social scale from Jairus, who clearly walks in without any difficulty at all. He can have a conversation with Jesus, but this woman coming up behind Jesus. She has been wealthy enough to afford physicians, but she is now without means. On the one hand, she seems shy. She certainly does not feel able to confront Jesus and fall at his feet openly, as does Jairus. Yet, on the other hand, she's prepared to touch Jesus' cloak. She possesses something like a magical way of thinking about Jesus and his garments. Neither Jesus nor Mark are interested in correcting her about this, and that interests me. I can just imagine if she came up to your typical, I don't know, Pentecostal healing meeting, thinking that if she touched the garment of Jesus, she'd be healed. Somebody might want to correct her about her theology. But healing and salvation do not come by theological precision, but by simple faith or trust in Jesus Christ. And the impoverished woman has this in bucket loads. Indeed, she is one of 4 women in Mark's Gospel who are presented specifically as role models of faith. It is faith, of course, that makes the difference for both the impoverished woman and for Jairus' daughter. Still, the exercising of faith is different in each instance. The woman has faith enough to reach out. She's shy, perhaps ashamed in some way, not because there was anything shameful about her condition necessarily, but because some of us feel shy and ashamed about speaking to important people. And we take a place at the back and we think, I don't really have a place in this setting. But she forced through all of that with a bit of magical thinking, but nevertheless to touch the garment, as Matthew has it, the hem of the garment of Jesus. Jairus' daughter may or may not have had faith. We're not told. But she seems now too ill or too dead to exercise it. Faith in her story is exercised by Jairus and those who gather around the little girl's bedside. What is it that Jesus says, not to the daughter, but to Jairus? Do not fear, only believe. Do not fear, only trust. Do not fear, only have faith. Do not fear, only enter into a relationship of trust with this Jesus whom you are calling to come to your daughter who has now died. Do not fear, only believe. If there's plenty of faith or trust in our passage, there's also plenty of fear. Did you notice that? The woman fears something like public exposure, so stays in the shadows until Jesus calls her out of them. Jairus fears that his daughter may have died and may thus be beyond the help of Jesus. Our text seems to say that faith can overcome fear. In illness, in social situations, even in death or its threat, faith in Jesus can make all the difference and bring wholeness and peace into the realms of death and despair. Do not fear, says Jesus, only believe. And we readers, who might know that the word for being healed is also the word for being saved, might hear the words as if spoken to us. Yes, all of us. Women, children, men, community leaders, and ordinary people can find life and salvation when we trust in Jesus and reach out to touch him. Yet even when such faith is beyond us, when we're too weak to exercise much faith of our own, the believing community can approach Jesus on our behalf and hold us in its prayers. Death gives way to life at the word of Jesus, at faith in Jesus that reaches out to touch him. Death gives way to life. If only we would believe it. For surely this is what our stories commend for the reader. Do not fear, only believe. Death gives way to life at the word of Jesus, at the touch of Jesus, if only we would believe it. Amen.